Francis Herron. He was the first person to offer services to the Union cause to suppress the rebellion of the secessionist states, and he was the last general to receive the surrender of an army, or of the Confederate Army in the United States, or in the Civil War, I should say. If you've ever seen Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, he talks about Wilmer McLean, and the Civil War started in his front yard at the Battle of Bull Run, and it ended in his front parlor in Appomattox Courthouse. Well, Francis J. Herron in January of 1961 offered his service to President Buchanan of the Governor Grays to go and suppress the rebellion of the secessionist state of South Carolina, which seceded from the Union in December of 1860, so just a month earlier. So there was much contention after the Civil War. Many states, many regiments laid claim to be the first to volunteer. There was research. Many believed that either Pennsylvania, New York, or Iowa company or infantry was the first to volunteer. Reporters went to work, they investigated the War Department records, and they came up with the actual letters from Herron, and they validated in newspaper articles that were published all throughout the United States that indeed the Governor Grays of Dubuque on January of 1861 were the first to volunteer for service in the Civil War. So Dubuquers were the first to volunteer. Later on in the Civil War then, General Herron would go on to become the youngest Civil War general in the Union Army until Custer was made general. And then he would go on to receive the surrender of Kirby Smith's Confederate Army in Shreveport, Louisiana, receiving the surrender of the fourth and final Confederate Army of the war. So Herron can rightfully say, and it's been well documented, that he offered the first service in the Civil War and he received the last surrender from the last battle of the Civil War of the last Confederate Army. There were 4 armies that surrendered. There was Lee's army that surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. Joseph Johnston's army surrendered to William Tecumseh Sherman in North Carolina at Bentonville. Richard Taylor's army surrendered to General Canby in Mobile, Alabama, and then Kirby Smith's army surrendered to Herron at Shreveport, Louisiana. And so these copies are actual copies from 1867, and they're located actually up at Loras College at the Center for Dubuque History. James Kephart was the second person to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor for service in the Civil War. He was one of those Dubuquers that entered not an Iowa regiment, but one of those U.S. Infantries that had offices in Dubuque. He entered the 13th U.S. Infantry. As I mentioned before, the 12th and the 13th U.S. Infantry had over 500 Iowa men that were raised out of Camp Franklin and served in it. So he actually won his citation at the Siege of Vicksburg. He was the first person to actually plant a Union flag on a Confederate earthworks as they charged up the hills of Vicksburg from the river basin of the Mississippi River. That occurred in 1863. He did not receive his medal till 1899. The third Dubuquer to receive a Congressional Medal during the Civil War was Private George Washington Healy for his service in Company E of the 5th Iowa Cavalry. Healy captured some enemy soldiers in Georgia and received the Congressional Medal of Honor for that in 1899. Healy was actually born and raised and died in Dubuque. He's buried at Linwood Cemetery. He was a hardware clerk and merchant his entire life. He had a hardware store, Healy Brothers and then Healy and Sons, which is located on Main Street. The building still stands today. It's where Pepper Sprouts is. He died in the home he built at 701 Bluff Street, which still stands today. Not only did he win the Congressional Medal of Honor for capturing Confederate soldiers, he was also a prisoner of war at Andersonville Prison, and he was also a guard of Jeff Davis's after Jeff Davis was captured. And he wrote a letter home regarding that. On May 10th, 1865, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured by Union soldiers in Irwinville, Georgia, south of Atlanta. Davis was transported to Atlanta, where he was then taken by the 5th Iowa Cavalry, including Corporal Healy, to Augusta, Georgia, where Davis could be placed on a train and taken to Fort Monroe, Virginia, where he would be tried. As they escorted Davis from Atlanta to Augusta, Georgia, a young 8-year-old Woodrow Wilson, a resident of Augusta, Georgia, watched the 5th Iowa Cavalry take Jeff Davis by in a prison train, which was being pulled by horses. And Healy later wrote to his family in Dubuque regarding this. Jeff Davis, with family and assistants, were taken out of the wet by the Yankee Cavaliers. He and his family were brought here and sent to Augusta, Georgia, escorted by 100 men of our regiment, the 5th Iowa Infantry. I was on the detail. Every time I had the opportunity, I would look at him, and he seemed to take it perfectly easy for one who was liable to suffer death. When the train arrived at the station in Augusta, thousands of people were there to look at him for the last time. At every station on our way down were a large number of soldiers and citizens to see if it was true that Jeff Davis was our prisoner. They would ask us what we were going to do with him. The answer they would get was, hang him, and hang he will, no doubt, although he and his family were treated with respect by us. Jefferson Davis never was hanged, only served 2 years in prison for his role in the War of Rebellion, and he ended up living until 1889 when he died in New Orleans. At his bedside when he died was Dubuquer George Wallace Jones, Iowa's first senator. Jones followed the body, or went with the body, from New Orleans all the way to Richmond for the burial in Richmond, Virginia, at which point he also gave a eulogy of his longtime friend Jefferson Davis, who he always kept in touch with. The fourth and last individual to win a Congressional Medal of Honor from the city of Dubuque was Orson W. Bennett. Orson came to Dubuque at the age of 6 years old when his family emigrated from the east. He actually initially served in the 1st Iowa Infantry and was wounded in the left leg at the Battle of Wilson Creek. That was a 100-day infantry, so once his service was up, he moved across the river to Hazel Green, and he ended up enlisting in Company G of the 12th Wisconsin Infantry, in which he served a term until he had the opportunity to enlist in the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry, which eventually became the 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry. And he ended up winning his Congressional Medal of Honor for services in the Charleston, South Carolina area. The 102nd U.S. Colored Troops, their infantry fought alongside of the 54th Massachusetts at places like Fort Wagner and Morris Island in the Charleston area. And so he ended up winning his medal in service of the 102nd U.S. Colored Troops. He ended up coming back to Dubuque to live for a little bit after the war, but ended up moving around and ended up dying and being buried around the Omaha, Lincoln, Nebraska area. Jefferson Coates served in the 7th Wisconsin Infantry, the heralded Iron Brigade. He won his Congressional Medal of Honor at Gettysburg, the first day of Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863, in which he was battling the enemy, trying to hold the lines, and he ended up getting both of his eyes shot out, so he was blind, which explains his picture in the glasses. In the picture you can see he is wearing his Congressional Medal. He ended up living the rest of his life in the place he was born. That was Boscobel, Wisconsin. Henry Taylor was part of the 45th Illinois Infantry. He was from Galena, Illinois. He ended up winning the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was awarded his in 1893. He won it for service at Vicksburg, for being one of the first to go up and capture a Confederate flag. Both men are buried in this area as well, and are Congressional Medal of Honor winners. The Grand Army of the Republic, which kind of brought us here tonight, is the Veterans Association made up of veterans after the Civil War was over. It was incorporated in Decatur, Illinois in 1866. It's very much like the VFW, Veteran of Foreign Wars, or the American Legion. It is just a veterans group for Civil War veterans. There were hundreds of posts all across the United States. It dissolved in 1856 when the last known living survivor of the Civil War, Albert Wilson of Windham, Minnesota, passed away. Albert was a Union soldier who never did see any battle, but he was the last soldier to pass away in 1856. At that time then, all the property and all the responsibility of the Grand Army of the Republic went to the Sons of Union Veterans of Civil Wars based on an act of Congress. Dubuque County had 3 Grand Army posts in the county: Lookout post number 70 and Hyde Clark post number 78, for which we have a Civil War sketches book in the case that we're displaying. That is from Hyde Clark post number 78 here in Dubuque. People like August Hamill and George Washington Healy were members of Hyde Clark post number 78. My great-great-grandfather George Pregler was member of post number 70. Joe Davis County had 2 posts, one in Galena and one in East Dubuque. And then you can see there were a variety of posts, 5 posts in Grant County, including Platteville, Boscobel, Lancaster, Potosi, and Hazel Green. In Boscobel, they still have the original Grand Army meeting center. It's the only original GAR meeting center in the state of Wisconsin or the greater Midwest. It's also a GAR museum. It is a wonderful resource to go and see artifacts from the soldiers and from the history of the Grand Army of the Republic, and it's by appointment only. This is just a picture that I obtained several years ago. It's of either an infantry or a Grand Army post reunion, believed to be circa about 1890. It's allegedly either taken in Dubuque or Jackson County, but I've never been able to place who the soldiers are, if they're with an infantry reunion or with a Grand Army reunion, and I don't know where the building is. So if anybody recognizes this building, I would very much appreciate knowing where it is. It's red brick. Judging by the size, it's either related to a Catholic school or church or organization, or it's a government building, would be my guess. We do have some, or the book that I rediscovered in the library's archives when I was doing some research is this wonderful book called Personal War Sketches, presented to Hyde Clark Post number 78, Dubuque, Iowa, Department of Iowa, by the Women's Relief Corps and the Wives of the Comrades, 1898. What the Post did was they procured this book from a publisher in, I believe it was Ohio or Pennsylvania, in which you would pass out a common questionnaire to all the veterans in the Post, and they'd fill out the answers to each of the questions. You'd take all the questionnaires, you'd send it to the publisher, and then they would actually go into the book and they would hand write out, the same person would, each soldier's individual personal sketch, saying who they were, where they enlisted, what regiment they were in, what their first battle was, who their comrades were, and what their most memorable event of the war was. We've actually transcribed those, digitized those, and eventually those will be posted under the Grand Army of the Republic section on encyclopediadubuque.com or .org. We have Randy Lyon here, the author of the original Encyclopedia Dubuque, who takes great care in updating and managing that website. He does a wonderful job. It's a great resource to look up information on Dubuque, not just the Civil War. Anything related to Dubuque can just about be found there. This is a reunion picture of the Company 5th Iowa Infantry. In this picture, we actually have 3 members of the Hyde Clark Post. We have August Hamill, we have George Washington Healy, who's wearing his Congressional Medal, and we also have here Thomas Allen. Each one of these has a personal sketch in the book itself. I'm not going to go too in-depth on some of these sketches, but I'm going to read a few things from a couple of these sketches here for you here right now. You can go online, like I said, encyclopediadubuque.org. do a search on Grand Army of the Republic, and you will see here in the next couple days a link to the contents of this book. There's about 68 veteran sketches that will be part of that posting. August Hamel is one of them. August Hamel's descendant, Bill Hamel, former Dubuque City Councilman, was a descendant of August Hamel. August Hamel enlisted August 26, 1861 at Camp Franklin in Dubuque in Company E of the 5th Iowa Cavalry. He was taken prisoner of war May 5, 1862 at Lockridge Mill by Claiborne's command, from which he was paroled at Corinth, Tennessee, July 29, 1864 near Newman, Georgia by able troops. Was later imprisoned at Andersonville, Georgia from July 26, 1864 to April 28, 1865. Was moved to Mellon, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, Blackshear, Georgia, Thompsonville, Georgia, and back to Andersonville, Georgia, where on December 25, 1864, had 1 ear of corn for 3 days' rations to eat. He left prison April 28, 1865 in feeble health, was released by close of war at Jacksonville, Florida. He weighed on entering the service was 165 pounds. When released from service, he weighed nothing more than 85 pounds. So he almost starved to death in Andersonville prison. While being marched about to different prisons, was barefooted and broke the ice with bare feet, had only 1 ear of corn for 3 days' rations on Christmas dinner, 1864. That was August Hamel. And many, many soldiers suffered the same fate, not just in Confederate prisons like Andersonville or Libby Prison in Virginia. We had prisons that were just as bad in Washington, D.C., New York. We had a major Union prisoner of war prison, Fort Armstrong, Rock Island Armory, in which hundreds and hundreds of Confederates served as prisoners. Several are buried. And it's just an amazing story, each and every one of them, when you get a chance to look at these personal sketches, where they served, the battles they went through, the time they spent in hospitals, the time they spent in prison, and just the valor and the courage that these individuals gave. Andrew Young McDonald served in the 1st Iowa and the 21st Iowa Infantry. He was wounded twice.